Welcome, everyone. My name is Mel Hardy. I am associated with the Political Leadership Academy at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And this is my presentation during Peace Week. I'm asking all of you in the audience to stress test what I am calling my speculative theory on a new world order. Now, that's a lot of highfalutin language. And as we talk about peace building and conflict resolution, I need to give you the antecedents of why I would have the hubris to actually approach something like this. I come out of Columbia University School of International Affairs. I was a student of both Brzezinski and Kissinger. In that way, I am interested in global affairs, like all of you are. One in our audience, Mr. Krause, we're going to hear from him later, was at the Wilson School in International Affairs as well. And all of you have both, and those in the audience have interests in both domestic issues and also global affairs. So today, I want to stress test this theory, which has as its final outcome a set of queries, a set of questions that we hope will get answered over time. There is a predicate that underpins all of how I think about my lens on the world, and that is that creative people are important, that there is an endowment associated with humans, because if you are created, you are creative. And with that endowment, we should honor creatives. And I consider that with that endowment, all humans are creatives. However, in the context of the three pillars of modern political economy, the state, markets, and civil society, it may be that the creatives, at least those that predicate their creative output on human flourishing and human betterment, may be subsumed to the pillars of the state and markets. So we're going to ask a set of questions today that I'm hoping that you will help me answer over time. And we're going to start with a set of questions in, I got a pointer here. The state, markets, and civil society. I hope those of you who are online can see the screen here. And then we're going to ask the general, journalist questions. What are we talking about? Who are we talking about doing what? Why would they do it? Where would they do it? How would they do it? And when? So we're going to try to get to all of those. We're going to put in the context all of those things. Now, a big issue for me in looking at these issues of the New World Order is how we think about survival commodities in the context of speculative commodities. So what are those survival commodities? They're issues of, we got to survive in housing. We have to survive with health. We need education. We need food security. We need safety. All of these things, I think, are survival commodities, but in the context of markets, there are some who speculate on how to engage with that from market perspective. So one of the questions that we will ask today is whether or not, in that pursuit of understanding the context, can we get at the predicate of human flourishing and human betterment in the matter of policy making? I do not know if we are on the Shar side, which is the policymaking school here at George Mason, or we're right next door to the Scalia School. But these are my set of questions as a instructor here at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict making. This issue of policymaking is vital in looking at any aspect of complex political economies. So I am hoping that we will imagine together the role of the arts, culture, and humanities and the creatives that we will define in civil society and their activism in that, okay? And then we're engaged with the Political Leadership Academy. I think we're in for a refresh on the name, but the matter of how the cohorts that come out of this training in the art and peace engagement in the Carter School's Political Leadership Academy, how do we find ourselves in state, market, and civil society governance? It is governance that engages policy. It should be creatives who help in the cause governance. So we're going to have a little geometry lesson. We're going to look at this triangle. Go to the next. We'll look at this triangle in which those fundaments of political economy are the state, markets, and civil society. We talk about government at all levels, local, county, whatever, markets, the business community, and civil society. It just so happens that members of civil society also populate markets in the state. But markets tend to dominate the perspective of those civil society participants, and so does the state. So anyways, we know that this is how this triangle works. Again, I come out of Brzezinski's triangulation theory at Columbia. So I think in terms of geopolitical triangles, but I'm gonna evolve that because we are going to look at a pentagon. We're gonna morph the geopolitical Trilateral Commission formed in the mid-70s that included Europe, the United States, and Japan. There's your green triangle. And the theory is to build Pentagon that is the arts, culture, and humanities Pentagonal Commission of the 21st century. This is evolutionary, and maybe evolutionary, revolutionary, well, whatever, we'll try to manage with this. But here's where I start. That creatives solve problems. Again, it's a triplet. There's a musical term, Richard. Triplet. Creatives solve problems. And the other triplet that's important is do no harm. Do no harm. We're talking about humans. Humans throughout the world. In this case, in the domestic context, it's humans. In the American context or the North American context, but let's talk about the Americans. Do no harm. Do no harm. Those are two of the triplets that I tend to focus on. So let's go back and look at this dynamic interaction of the state, markets, and civil society. What we know is that when these organizations that we focus on, we have to find out, well, what does this dynamic interaction mean? And for whom does it mean? And how do we interact with it? And I consider that we have to focus on what I consider to be honest broker institutions. These honest broker institutions, what you will define in just a couple of minutes, and there is a major influence center for building peace and peace culture transformation. And the creatives who predicate their output on human flourishing, human betterment, have to be influence centers in that cause. And purpose of my class in PLA is to move the creative class that are with my teaching practice toward activism. So these three influence centers, again, three, they sit in a triangle. There's a dynamic interaction between them as well. And Kyle is into futures thinking. So hopefully we can get more creatives engaged in futures thinking as well. So that's what we have here, the Carter School and the PLA. We are growing our numbers of art and peace fellows. There's another program, the foundations class, which is typically around policy issues. And then if in fact the art and peace fellows engage in like these kinds of practices, then hopefully we can help them discover their own identity as creative, whatever the endeavor of life they will find themselves. They're architects or carpenters or plumbers or medical physicians or whatever endeavor they find themselves, they can be creatives in human flourishing and human betterment. And they can interact with these honest broker institutions, and you need to move them toward activism. So there's the dynamics. In matters of the state, markets, and civil society, we have and need to discover the honest broker institutions, who are our creatives, and how do we move them to activism so that there could be, what I think is that when you have the state, markets, and civil society interacting dynamically, then that's where small d and big D democracy can thrive. When there is imbalance, where the markets capture the state, it's always at the expense of civil society. That imbalance, that lack of equilibrium, when we know over time, different stresses and pushes and pulls and tugs and interests, it's not always going to be static. There is dynamism, a natural dynamism in any political economy. The question is, can we get to a place where civil society remains with a voice in the equilibrium of that dynamic triangle? Now, heretofore, we've talked about the triangle, and we've talked about the United States, Europe, and Japan, because the Trilateral Commission, as envisioned by David Rockefeller, who was advised by Zbigniew Brzezinski, and then engaged Jimmy Carter for his run for presidency, that the focus was on kind of balancing world interest with the United States in a unipolar position. A lot of people are going to argue about this. We're going to have that argument with partners in Europe and at that time, Japan. Today, the Trilateral Commission, which still exists, talks about Asia, not just Japan. But in the post-World War II environment of the 70s, America's century, 20th century, World War II, dominant in manufacturing, Marshall Plan, rebuilding Asia. This was a unipolar world, at least conceived by those of us here in the United States. And we took on partners in Europe and Japan. However, that triangle may not be as accurate today because we have other actors in the world. We have other geopolitical interests that are pushing against unipolarity, not even bipolarity, not even multilateralism, but I consider polylateralism. There's so many interests in this world that are coming from these different forces in the world, and we have to evolve this trilateral thinking in the 20th century to a 21st century pentagonal framework that includes the other geopolitical interests of the global South. India is pushing its way in. They think they are going to overtake China. Their geography, landmass, their size, concentration of educational interests suggests to Modi that that's going to be the case. China's not having it. Russia wants to be at play. So there's lots to consider here. But what do we think? We know that in the post-Columban era, when Mr. Columbus discovered the New World, and global trade developed differently than it was theretofore, that there were both evolutionary and revolutionary efforts at trying to create the balance in geopolitics. So this issue of in global geopolitics, even domestic politics, how do we think about survival commodities, private ownership of speculative commodities? Does that inure to the benefit of civil society writ large? I'm going to ask the question, if one posits that there is enough wealth to support the survival commodities, why do we have poverty? It's a question. I don't know the answer to that one. I sort of do, but this course really it kind of focuses on people to discover their creativity and to observe what I might consider the maladies in civil society, markets in the state, and if in fact creatives solve problems, then perhaps we should be engaged in solving problems. So that activism can help in the cause of rebalancing, getting the equilibrium of that dynamic tripartite engagement of the state, market, civil society. And end game for me is always about moving creatives who think differently to find ourselves in governance. So just a sidebar, I do engage with different institutions in town. Sometimes I sit with people from the Department of Defense, some of the other think tanks, and there is a predisposition here in Washington that the United States still maintains overdominance in power, military, economic. All of those things are true. I think there's some other pushes on that, and not everybody's playing ball with that, as we can see. So, so I think it's incumbent upon us in the United States, our policymakers to think differently, but I don't think they will think differently until other people are around the table asking questions, providing counsel, providing advice, actually being responsible for policymaking. So, so these are some of the questions we've asked about who, what, where. This is the who question. Who are the creative class practitioners? And in this way, you know, I'm not going to demean, you know, Mr. Richard Florida and the great work that he's done to talk about the rise of cities in the creative class, meaning those that are coming from the technology industries and the finance industries as the way that, you know, cities rise and, you know, nation states are born and they thrive and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure I believe all of that theory. I would suggest that perhaps if we define the creative class differently, then perhaps we can get to some other outcomes. What are we talking about? We're talking about the impact of these creatives on the state market and civil society. There's a report that came out, San Francisco Fed, April 2021. It's called the Economic Gains from Equity. What it looked at was labor force participation across race and gender. And what they said is in 2019 alone, the United States squandered $3 trillion in GDP. The San Francisco Fed, principal author was the president of the San Francisco Fed, Mary Daly, who wrote that paper, major paper, the economic gains from equity. I think we ought to think about that. If, in fact, we think that the Federal Reserve is an honest broker, at least on the analytical side, then maybe that's something we should look at. We should look at that analysis so that we might consider that participation in the political economy across the ethnocultural, geographic, ability spectrum might inure to the benefit of more people in civil society. That's a data point I think we ought to look at. So why are we doing this? I put some bullets here. You know, what I call cultural dissonance. I mean, the lost cause is a part of our nation's cultural dissonance. Some people should fare better than others for whatever reason. I think that there is enough wealth to accommodate the accommodation of citizenry in our country, that the issues of belonging and inclusion across our ethnocultural ability, economic, geographic spectrum. Cool. This matter of technology and all of these stresses coming from all over the place, the environmental, the issues of water security and stresses, all of these are are important. You know, this is some phrasing that's going to be controversial for me, for people to investigate me around the American caste system. This issue of individualism and exceptionalism, kind of like dominating the cultural predisposition of certain of our communities vis-a-vis others. And maybe we should be looking at this new world order. Maybe we should challenge the new world order by a better understanding of the polylateralism that is expressed by forces outside of our control, maybe now outside of our dominance. So this is my little geometry lesson. We've morphed from triangle to a pentagonal. We do have the world here now with their interests. That's inexorable. We're not gonna contain these other forces throughout the world because they're all pushing for their own place. I think that creatives who become activists, who predicate their output here, regardless, again, whatever walk of life, our engineers, our scientists, our medical practitioners, our legal practitioners, our policymakers, we all, if that was the underpinning of our work, then perhaps our world could be better or different. Lots of stresses on the world, you know, everybody's trying to go into space and find out what that frontier is, going into the Arctic to claim a kind of proprietary interest. We're overfishing. Some of it's part of the parallel economy that's out of the mainstream economy. But in what we're trying to get to this Pentagonal Commission, at least this part of it, is to look at a different kind of dynamism where the creative class will actually contribute to thinking. So the honest broker, I mean, I was at dinner the other night listening to Jason Moran play Duke Ellington's piano solos. I had never known Duke Ellington to be the pianist that was written. I mean, that it was fantastic. The guy said, hey, listen, you know, I understand that you like to talk about honest brokers. So, you know, this guy, Ted Goya, how I became an honest broker. He's a music critic. This is a phrase that I lifted. The honest broker represented an entirely different model for correcting the course we need at this juncture in cultural history. Correcting the course. I think we need a course correction. I think we could all benefit from the course correction where humans aspire better. You can't aspire well when your entire community is in abject poverty. It's not possible. And my question is, you know, who else can help us think through that differently than the traditions of the state and markets. So here are my questions. I focus on, everyone knows that my classes center on museums and libraries. Those are the venues in which I have my classes. And the purpose is to imbue the course participants in the environment of the creatives. These beautiful spaces, museums, libraries, so that we can feel it and intuit it as a part of how we think about our own beings in the pursuit of the identification of our creative selves, our activist selves, and that pathing toward governance. So the question, can the museum and library ecosystem in the arts, culture, and humanities, can we use their venues? Will they use their venues to catalyze a new American identity based on belonging? And they expand their franchise across the ethnocultural, ability, geographic, and economic spectrum of the American civil society. And they be in coalition to expand their impact on expanded GDP. And they engage with those other influence centers in the philanthropic, state markets, and will they adopt their roles as honest brokers? And I say, yeah, but I don't know when. So that's it. It's pretty linear, I hope. And with that, I'm asking that you challenge my assertion that the answer is yes. And my consternation about when we can get to this. So I have invited a member of the Fourth Estate that congressionally, it's actually not congressionally mandated, but it's been assumed that a thriving democracy requires a challenge to government and to ask questions, to do the research and represent the American people. So Charles Krause is all-around brainiac, but great writer, journalist. He also a PLA fellow. I'm going to ask you, Charles, what's your reaction to this?
Well, first of all, congratulations. I think you've done a very interesting presentation. I really do. I think it has a lot of merit. I would question, well, a minor thing is you don't include theaters and other cultural institutions that might also be engaged in this sort of endeavor, but that's relatively minor. The question goes, I suppose, to what people think about the human. I mean, this is not an original question or thought, but you know, do we good? Do we engage this way? Do we, you know, just because you can define people as creative, but does that mean they're going to create things that are positive? And who's going to define positive? Because, you know, at the end of the day, that's part of the problem. People define it differently, and therefore, you know, we get into all kinds of trouble because of that, I think. And you know, I don't have the answer to those questions, but I don't, you know, there's creativity, and then there's a kind of desire, something built into certain people who feel the need to use their creativity on behalf of society as a whole, for whatever reason, and others who really don't. and can be very selfish about their creativity. You could argue that Elon Musk is very selfish. He's creative. He's certainly done a lot of incredible things, but he doesn't seem to be interested in, or he has his own ideas of how to use his creativity and the wealth that has come from it, you know. And to bring it a little closer to home, because he went to the University of Pennsylvania, which I did too, and I was a trustee of the University of Pennsylvania even. You know, but this whole recent controversy there, which we don't have to go into in detail, but I was really surprised. I don't know why, but the leaders of the revolt were all a bunch of Trump supporters, which really took me by surprise, I think, for a variety of reasons. But nonetheless, you know, as we think about where we are in this country right now, and who is going to influence the way things develop over the next 7 or 8 months, I guess. One thing that happened last night that I was telling Mel that I found very interesting, some of you may have seen it, some have not, but MSNBC, the anchors took over the broadcasts, and this has never happened before. This is absolutely revolutionary. I mean, having worked in television as a correspondent for many years, the correspondents are called talent, and that's it's a kind of insult, really, in a way, because it sort of suggests that they don't have a brain in that. They're just there presenting all this stuff and don't really think about it. But last night they commandeered live television to criticize their own company for hiring, the former head of the RNC, and it isn't even not only their view about hiring her, but the fact that they actually seized television. They did. That was not scripted. That was not part of the, and that's a power shift. I don't think they're going to let them get away with it. I think we are in for, maybe the best reality TV of all time to see how this plays out, because Comcast, which owns the whole thing, and can't afford to have the journalists just decide they're going to say whatever they want on TV, and well, we'll see how this works out. But it is they seized power last night. And I don't think that the powers that be can afford to let them do that, because if they do, then that's going to start happening all over the place. And that would be great. But I don't think they're going to want to do that. Great though, but maybe not great too, because we have to think about it. MSNBC, fine. I may agree with them, maybe some others do. But then again, there are all kinds of other people floating around who could seize time, and it wouldn't be so great. So, we have to think about that too. But anyway, all of that, I think that there's some very interesting ideas here. And I think that if nothing else, it would be, we've had lawyers running, it's like lawyers and generals have run the country since the end of World War II, or maybe even before that. But everybody's a lawyer. They don't think of anybody to do anything unless they're a lawyer. And I think we could make a case that lawyers haven't done a very good job in a lot of ways. And, it's make the case that some other people who think in different ways should be brought into the mix in order to create policies that are maybe more responsive and more humane and all of that sort of thing. I don't think it's going to, war and some of the big issues that there are floating around. I don't know that just bringing in a few painters or sculptors or wherever you want are going to solve that problem, but it would help to bring people who think differently into the mix, because, we are where we are, and it's not satisfactory, I think, to a lot of people. So that's my,
Charles, let me tease this out of you. You mentioned that there are a lot of creatives, some of whom, do, good work, and some of them don't. So if we look at the bell curve of artists or creatives, we're going to find, the broad middle, and we're going to find that some that sit out in SD 1, 2, or 3. And we also have another scale, the empirical rule, the Pareto principle, the vital few, who sometimes look at about 20% of any population that's going to influence the other 80. That's rough cut, but whatever. And I'm not sure that I don't think, and I'm not a statistician, I'm not an econometrician, but I think if we can look at 4% of influence centers that would ascend to policy. You've heard me say this 1,000 times. You can't boil the ocean, but you can boil a cup at a time. So we look at discrete, finite things that can be influential into the kind of design, the imagination that we might want to see. And I guess that's where I look at these millions of creatives, millions of artists out here. There are a lot of them, but there are only some of them that meet that test for where we think we can imagine a better future. So,
but again, it's your or our definition of what that better future looks like, and they're not all going to agree. I mean, I don't know how you measure, what it takes to, some people, think they should be president of the United States. Not everybody does. I don't think, in fact, most people don't. But but to have that kind of drive and that kind of, is unusual. I mean, it's not the usual thing, and it's dangerous sometimes because those people are not always good people. I mean, that's what we're finding out. Sure.
I have to jump in because this is so stimulating that I'm just dying over here because there's so much going on. But what you spoke about that happened with MSNBC, it actually started Sunday morning.
Well, I know that. I know that.
So,
yeah.
And it was NBC, the parent, not the parent, but it started percolating Sunday morning with some very concise, harsh words. However, I thought it was refreshing. I thought it was wonderful because we're so used to other people saying things openly and aggressively, and we're sitting here quietly being our well-mannered, respectful selves and not saying anything, and they're just blowing all kinds of weird stuff at us. And to that point too, I think it's the people who are quiet, who would love to say something, and at some point those words will come out, and maybe they won't come out the same way as what we see on Fox or what we see when we got all these sound bites, never-ending sound bites from the Trump team. But I think this is a wonderful approach to changing and integrating a more humanistic and empathetic approach to how we want to live and in what kind of environment we want to live in. But it's happening already. If you look at what happened at the United Nations, and you referenced the southern countries pushing, it was South Africa that started with the first proposition about sanctioning Israel. And So, but it didn't go away. What has happened is there's this humanistic, rational coalition that's building, and it's not it's not the European-centered, US-dominated powers on the globe. It's the others who are emerging, just like I'll take a microcosm like Washington, DC. Things are changing. We baby boomers, I mean, I'm a baby boomer, so everybody, we have a couple of different generations represented here. But there is a generation emerging that would benefit greatly because nothing they're getting in the school system, nothing they're getting because libraries and museums are wonderful, but they don't have the gravitas to bring people in. Who is at the center? We have to deal with who is at the center of and controlling and has the initial impact and opportunity to move young people and maybe even I guess the millennials, or what is the next generation after the millennials?
Gen Z.
Gen Z into a more into more opportunities where they can cultivate the kinds of sensibilities that you're talking about, because it's already happening. I believe that there will be a free Palestine within the next 5 years. Not because of what baby boomers are doing or because the US is the most powerful country on the planet or the most prosperous, but because a group of people want it to be so. And it will be so. And it won't be European centered. Because when you look at the globe, there's only a few people that want to be communists, and there's a whole lot more people that want to have certain kinds of freedoms and voices, and they're not white. The majority of this planet is comprised of people of color. And those people are starting to have a stronger voice.
Who else is reacting to this conversation? Should I let, how do I let people, should I unmute them?
They can unmute themselves.
Oh, okay. Anybody online have any reactions to this conversation? We'd love to hear you.
They can type it in the chat.
Or you can type it in the chat, I understand. So anybody who wants to unmute, please do so.
Ask to unmute.
Yeah, please unmute yourselves. And if you have comments, we'd love to hear you. Or anybody else in the room. Kyle.
Yeah, so I thought it was an interesting presentation, and so what it seems to me is that a lot of the balancing that you're talking about is, overall has to do with a lot of the image of various images of the future of what the United States position is within this kind of equitable, which I think is a good analysis and something that we need to contend with. And what I think has been really interesting from the future's perspective, but then also within the kind of overall artist perspective, has been a lot of the and market encroachment on the creative space by AI and technology. And I think that what's really interesting right now is I think that we're starting to see a little bit of pushback or more intentional conversation about the space that art has and what it means, and aside from the actual products of image or video, what the intrinsic value is of humans doing that activity, and how they're carving out their own space. And I think that there's, you know, aside from the kind of, you know, disruption to the different, like the economy of art itself, you know, I think that you do have consumers also making different choices to support, people's creative output that is not machine aided or not, taken. So I think that that's been like a really kind of interesting side to the triangle that you're presenting here. And in the class that I'm teaching on futures and peace building in the US right now too, you know, a lot of the students are 18 and 19. So I'm also noticing just from their perspective that, you know, a lot of the things that we're worried about of, you know, technology, like hollowing out social spaces or moving primarily to virtual contexts, or kind of basically everything that would be like the kind of techno capitalist market overreach into the other sectors, that, you know, they've kind of borne the brunt of all of the negative effects of that. And so I think that there's starting to be a lot more like pushback within their generation, which I think is very important within this whole conversation about like how are you re-engaging people about the one thing that I also think, so you talk about the survival economy versus the speculative, or survival commodities versus speculative commodities. But where I thought you were going with it, but you didn't, was actually thinking of speculation as a commodity in terms of generating images or pathways of the future, and kind of the way that people are also trying to sell, create different ideas and then sell those images in the future, kind of meeting this, you know, bottom up demand for, when people feeling the impact of, you know, cause, or just seeing, or kind of having their vision of the future being narrowed down into essentially a collapse narrative, democratic backsliding, you know, another Trump presidency. There's like so many different ways that like people are typically talking about what the trajectory is, but that doesn't encompass like all the other varieties of you know, a transformation future, one where you have a government or in the public sector that's more active in shaping a pathway forward, or if you have a just general growth, the trends actually do just continue into the future, and there isn't like some kind of big collapse. So I think what we've been part of what you were saying within that, Charles, in terms of how do you manage that plurality, is I actually think that creatives need to play a role in terms of creating the speculation for what all the pathways can be, because it's not a question of like, can we find the one right pathway or best predict and analyze the pathway forward, but can we just get people out of this really negative, emotional drain narrative that the country is like headed down with. And I think that that is like that is so reinforced from every angle, even if you're on like the good side, then you don't really have anywhere else to go. And so it becomes like its own self-reinforcing dynamic. So I think just like breaking out the plurality, the creatives and art is like a really great way to do that, because you can help people expand their thinking without directly hitting things that, you know, take them into the trap of a certain type of narrative, right? You can use the abstraction, you know, all your metaphors and analogies, whatever else, creative use of space to take people into a different possible world. And I think that that's where a lot of this can really be helpful for this endeavor.
You know, amongst the things that we've seen recently is the primacy of the conversation. Gathering people together that may or may not come out of the same tribe. One of the things that I've said so many times is we have as many cultures in the United States as we have zip codes. And neighbors tend to reinforce neighbors wherever they are. There are some cultural predispositions to that. However, in the matter of thinking of an American identity with all of the challenges associated with the original founding, the original predisposition, even our founding documents were designed by people who thought a certain way, perhaps in a certain caste, that you know, may be challenged by the realities of a global dynamism that's going to be forced on us. You know, there were so many discussions about the migration issues. We talk about all these forces, water resources, climate issues, food security issues, heat issues, you know, all of these things that are going to look at the dynamism of a world in which we have to think through differently. I do think, you know, Kyle, as you know, do futures thinking and guide your students that way, it's really significant to do that. There's
Well, it looks like Amber has a comment too.
Miss Amber, thank you for joining us. What's up?
Can you guys hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, congratulations, Mel. It's a conversation, good presentation. And as you know, I definitely have some shared beliefs and try to share them in relationship to my own work as an artist. I don't know that I wanted to say much more. I would have loved to have known a little bit more about this presentation prior, meaning within the last week or so. So I could have contributed something more, but I just hope that the conversation continues. It is absolutely warranted. And that, like, as you mentioned, that the participants are broadened, because this is a conversation that cannot continue to only happen in silos.
So Amber, just to let you know, I do have this presentation in Charlottesville, Virginia, coming up in April. The reason being that we're going from big urban, we're here in Washington, D.C., or its suburbs, to smaller urban, which touches on rural and Appalachia. So the idea is to widen this conversation.
Yeah.
So that, you know, we have more voices, both as listeners and participants in this conversation. With that, Amber, you know, I want to respond to Charles's comment about the role of theater as venue. Remember that most of our nonprofit organizations function on 3 sets of capitalization. One is venue capital, the other is intellectual capital, and they're all scrounging for money, financial capital. So I'll take out the financial and just look at the venue capital. Theaters are superior places for this, Charles. You're right. So Charles has not told you, but he is the American representative for, you know, the Shakespeare Theater in Gdansk, Poland. So, you know, this guy is so understated. It's remarkable, but, you know, we'll tease the best out of him, you know, as we go forward. But the theaters as venues is very important. He was also the founder of the Center for Contemporary Political Art. So the matter of looking at those voices and the venues for those voices, we're continuing to find spaces for those venues to to be shown. But indeed, Amber, thank you. Amber and I were on the same panel just last week to talk about the issues of collecting and the issues of the dynamics between the artists and collectors and the places where they're shown. So thank you, Miss Amber. Appreciate you greatly. Yes, Ann Farley is one of our PLA fellows. Ann, thank you.
I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Amber said about silos and Kyle said about creating new pathways and Charles and Mel talking about theater. As I look at this framework, which is fantastic, and I think gives us a great way for moving forward and using creatives and as, activists and in governance. I think Mel and I have talked briefly just in one of our other classes about, changing systems. And so how do we get to that point? And you all mentioned a little bit about museums and libraries being great places. I'm fairly new to the DC area, and I love the access to the museums and libraries and the 3 museums. I'm also suddenly aware in these past few years that some of those same wonderful resources are part of our government. They're part of some pretty steep bureaucracies, and they're hard to see change. And so I'm thinking about, using those museums and libraries, but also using these other places, and how do we use the creatives to open up those pathways so that we don't put stress on nonprofits necessarily, but what other places and how can we start enacting this change? And I mean, I was sort of slyly sitting here thinking about like, okay, here we are at GMU, and GMU is an amazing institution and also a very large one. And because of its size, by necessity has levels and layers of bureaucracy from what I can tell from the outside, just like many other places. Could we do something at a microcosm at GMU where we embed artists or try to solve problems in ways that get creatives involved in places people don't normally invite them to? And we do it on such a small scale somewhere that then we can show somebody else like, okay, this is how we did it somewhere. It's just so hard sometimes as a creative to get your foot in the door. So I'm thinking about all those things you said and how do we create those pathways?
Reggie is associated with National Opera Ebony in New York. And so we're just delighted with your presence here today as well.
And also I'm a former library employee. When we talk about creatives, and especially I'll talk about my narrow lane of musicians, we can't not talk about the financial aspect of it. Folks can't again, in this lane, they can't necessarily afford to be a creative without some sort of financial underpinnings. And it's difficult to raise money. Theater, it's great, they're great venues to have creative activism. Where does the money come from? That's a conversation that needs to be had throughout the communities, throughout every level. When you look at libraries, and given my former association with a major library in this area, it is a place that has it has authoritative information, it has performance spaces, all of that. The way that we leverage that is by connection. You can't, you simply don't pick up the phone and call the head of the library and say, I want to do, unless you already have some sort of connection with it. So I love this idea, and I do believe that museums and libraries are actually currently working as honest brokers. It may not look that way, but as we know from a political aspect, you've got all of these school boards and local groups, people who know nothing about research, who know nothing about authoritative information, doing this, which is really a disservice to younger folks who will, given the opportunity, engage with those institutions if they know that they are given the space to do whatever research they want, to be able to read any book and all of the stuff that people talked about from a small theater opera company perspective, we cannot mount anything that is creatively, that has any creative activism if we don't have folks in the back end who agree with that messaging. What we are seeing across that spectrum are donors who are pulling back because these opera companies are putting out productions that are predominantly Black cast, or the messaging is about whatever the messaging is, the drama, the real story, correcting the narrative or adding to the narrative. So while all of this is great, the reality on the ground for a lot of creatives within the arts and music in particular, the young artists and emerging artists is, you know, you got to have money. They've got to be able to pay their rent. They've got to be able to do all of these things.
And, you know,
So-
another thing's going too. Oh,
Yeah, we'll go online first and then Charles. What was that comment?
I was just going to say that it also means that we haven't had the right people in the room yet. I mean, if the funding isn't happening or it stops happening when you start to be real and honest about some of the plight of the citizens of this, you know, United States, then that means that you don't have the right people in the room yet. Because if I'm not mistaken, like I can't cite your name of the institution, but then that means that not enough people with the right funding, the right objective are funding these conversations. That's just my perspective. It just, I think even more reason, I can't, because I was driving when, when I was listening to this, and I'm stationary now, so I can't tell who said what. But the woman that was a couple comments prior was talking about getting people in the same, more people in the vein of creatives from different industries and bringing them together to continue this conversation. And I would just pose, you know, is there anybody in the room right now that can actually speak to that?
Well, I think that's our effort, Amber. That's what we're doing at the Political Leadership Academy. That's a big part of why I'm here. It's to kind of foster those institutional relationships, to move an agenda. Remember, the Museum of the 21st Century, or the Library of the 21st Century, is dealing with competing forces. The reckoning of the American narrative, historically, and the visioning about what is the most appropriate thing. If we concern ourselves with one of those data points that was mentioned earlier about the San Francisco Federal Reserve, how we look at equity and increases in GDP because we center on equity, then we're talking about capital, accretion of capital to do things for the American people. The present class does not think that way, but we have an honest broker institution that might be providing some guidance in that way. Charles.
well, a comment on that. I think it's a little bit unfair to expect, you know, I think Mel's done a lot of thinking about this, and I think that you're trying to sharpen it and you know, but there will come a point where then I think there comes a time when then you have to have a strategy for communicating this with a larger audience, and there are ways to do that. You know, I can think of several, and it's not impossible. But you have to be ready to do it, and you have to think through what the larger world is going to say and try to anticipate some of that, because, you know, everybody, you can't just walk in the door and say, well, give me 100 million and I'll just see what I can do with it. They just don't do it that way, unfortunately. But the other thing that's happening is, to your point, I think, with this AI business, you can't talk to anybody. And these stupid virtual assistants don't know, they give you 5 choices and none of them are what you're trying to find out. And that's it. And then what? I mean, we're becoming so isolated, you can't solve a problem. There's no way to solve a problem with the way things
I'll
are.
have a little pushback on that, because one of the things that, with the use of AI in particular, theaters and, high school productions, college theater productions, they are incorporating the use of AI to bring down the cost of productions. I mean, one of the things my company struggles with is how are we going to mount full-scale productions, given that we don't have any money. If you have been in the Opera House lately and you see the particular productions, you can see that we are, and they are trying to leverage what is going to happen. That the AI genie is out of the box. That's just how we control that, I think, is something that within the arts community, we have to give serious thought to. We have to ask young folks, how do we do this? Help us do this. As I refer to myself, because I might be the oldest person in the room.
Nope.
How do we old heads help you guys take all of this into the future and not let it gobble you up? That you can still be creative, that we can all still be creative when we step into the theater, how people can enjoy a performance.
Right, but that's one, sure, AI is gonna help in many ways, I'm sure. But it's also isolating us. There's just no other.
I don't disagree.
You can't talk to anybody. You have a problem. And, and I think frustration levels and the kind of political repercussions from all of this are going to be, I think we're seeing they're going to be very negative in a lot of ways. And I hope people are thinking about that too, because
Yeah, anybody else in the room have some, all of these issues that are being raised are replete with content for further investigation. And I know we've got students here, practitioners here, online. We've got the whole panoply of people who concern themselves with these issues. The question is, I guess I should have put here the honors, how and when. How and when. We know that in the interest of our own agency in human betterment, our own personal agency, my flourishing is your flourishing. I don't flourish unless you flourish. There's some people who don't subscribe to that. There are many people in positions of power who do not believe that. And so the question is, amongst the many questions, is how do that small subset, that 4%, find themselves in coalition with one to the other to actually move the needle to policy making toward human flourishing and human betterment. Tall order, tough order. However, that is the order. That is the question that we're trying to ask and the question we're trying to answer. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for your participation. I delight in those of you online who joined us, those of you in the room who joined us. It's been a great opportunity for me to think out loud in a teach the teacher kind of platform. I am advised by all of you to sharpen this this way of presenting. And I thank you very much for your participation.